Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, joined on the roundtable, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Marie Mayhew. Marie, how is it going?
Oh, it's going very well. It's going very well.
Kind of a drawn out.
Oh, it's going very well.
It's going pretty well. It's going very well.
It's going good. It's going good.
Been a hectic month.
I was just gonna say we're getting, you're coming down off of Thanksgiving, but you're ramping back up for the seasonal winter holidays, and you got to get your tree and your whatnot all ready. Your elf on the shelf, if you do that sort of stuff.
I don't, but yes, we could do that, I suppose. And we're also joined by the wonderful Mike Brown here from the Pleasing Terrors podcast. Mike, how are you tonight?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show.
No problem. Mike is one of my favorite podcasters. His show is amazing. If you're listening to the Mad Scientist podcast and you have not checked out Pleasing Terrors yet, then I don't know what you're doing. Pause the show, go download a bunch of Mike's shows, and then come back and finish this episode. So tonight's episode we're gonna be talking about ghosts and water, and kind of Mike, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about what you think about different paranormal things and everything. And but first off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your show?
Well, Pleasing Terrors is a paranormal themed podcast that also mixes in quite a bit of history and folklore with some true crime and even literature from time to time. I tend to like to try to find subjects where I can kind of pull different things and weave them together into one story.
All right, very cool, very cool. And Mike is part of Pleasing Terrors is part of Dark Myths, along with our show, of course, and a bunch of others. All your favorites, of course.
And one of my favorite Instagrams too, by the way.
Yeah, dude, you're killing Instagram, man. Your Instagram game is so much better than ours.
Some kind of creepy, tableau where I'm like squinting to see if is that like that blur in the corner? Is that a spectral form? But they're very good. I still think you should get some framed. I've been framed.
Well, I'm fortunate in that Charleston happens to be especially photogenic.
Yeah.
Particularly at night.
Yeah, so that's actually a really cool thing that listeners of this show you may not know. Mike, you are a ghost tour guide in Charleston.
That's right.
Right? And you've been doing that now for 20 years, I think you said.
20 years.
That's awesome, man. How do you get started in that? What kind of?
Well, I started off as a history tour guide and I started off giving Civil War tours.
Oh.
And I did that just because I was a history buff. And over time, I kind of ended up giving a lot of different themed tours. And one day, there were two guys that I was working with that were writing a book on Charleston ghost stories. And they went to a local haunted fire station to interview a fireman that worked there. And I didn't have anything better to do that day, so I just tagged along with them. And that was where I sort of got interested in the ghost stories, just sort of seeing the creepy stories mixed in with things that are happening relatively recently, mixed in with all the history. I really like the combination.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, one thing that I mean, the Civil War is rife with tragedy and really great ghost stories that come out of that. So I can definitely see. I mean, I feel sometimes it's kind of funny. My family is originally from Italy, my mom's side, anyways, and so that visiting Italy, it's you're struck by just how long things have been there. I mean, and of course, I mean, that sounds silly. Like everything's been everywhere for as long as we know, but there's rubble in their town and it's like, wow, this was here since the Roman Empire, but in America, it's sort of, everything is a couple of generations old at most,
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain parts of the country, like the kind of the old port cities and stuff. And that really have such a storied and long history that it makes for, I think, some really fascinating ghost stories in particular. And our ghost stories here in the U.S. seem to have they always seem to have kind of a particular flavor to them that aren't really there in European. I almost feel, and maybe this is a good question for Travis on one of the other Dark Myth shows, or some of the other. I know a couple of podcast hosts that are also tour guides, in their daily lives, and a lot of them seem to do ghost tours too, which is kind of cool. But
I was really banking on him saying I was an investment banker before I started.
Right. Yeah, I got scared out of my suit, right. And I came home.
Oh, so tell us how you got there. No, keep going. Sorry.
No, well, I find it fascinating that I feel like a lot of other countries have ghost stories where they do take their own flavor. So like European ghost stories seem to always be, this was a woman who was tortured for, in a castle somewhere, or this is the old maid of the castle, or the butler, or the king, or whatever. Whereas here in the U.S., it's a common person almost always. You have the occasional ghost story where it's the Vanderbilts haunting their crypt or something, but I don't know. I feel like we democratize everything here, and I like that we also have democratized our ghost stories. Which is kind of cool. Anyways, that was long-winded and seemingly didn't have a point, but we're going to move on. We're going to keep it in. It'll be fine. Let's get into the point of this actual episode here. Ghosts in water. So one thing that we're going to do here at first is each of us is going to read a little story or snippet or something that we have about a ghost story we like that's connected with water. And then that's just kind of where we're going to start the conversation. So Marie, do you want to kick us off here?
Absolutely. So my favorite, or one of my favorite ghost and water stories is actually pretty close to me, and it takes in a couple different things. It's with water. It's in a heavily wooded area, and it's with a hotel, because if you're gonna have a haunting, you really should have a hotel somewhere in it. And it's the Brooksdale Lodge in Santa Cruz Mountains, which is this sprawling, or it was at one point, this very sprawling lodge that opened in like 1870, and it was an old lumber mill, and it was purchased by a man by the name of H.J. Logan, and he is known to have created the loganberry, or he was a botanist who actually found and created the loganberry from that site.
He created a berry?
Well, I believe he might not have created a berry, but he was a botanist that found the berry, and maybe.
So he's like the guy that they credit with cultivating the banana. I get it.
So yeah, I don't know if the loganberry is in the same stratosphere as the banana, but close. It's close. Okay. It's not as known, but still. So this man had some money. He fell in love with the area, and he opened this huge lodge in the 1870s that was pretty prosperous, and then it was sold. It was sold in the 40s, and at that point, the new owner, which was a man by the name of Camp, opened this, built onto it, and opened this huge dining room, which he called the Brook Room. And the Brook Room dining room actually has the appearance of almost like a Swiss chalet inside, and it has a fully running brook right through the middle of it.
Oh wow.
So they've incorporated all of this, like these ginormous redwoods, sort of into the actual building itself, and some of the foundation and some of the pillars of these huge redwoods, and then they have this fully operating stream that is through their main dining room. And if you look online and you see pictures, you just put in Brook Room Santa Cruz, you'll see this gorgeous setting of this multi-tiered kind of wooded chalet with this natural brook that's flowing right through the center of it, and has this gorgeous chandelier above. So it's a really like an amazing an amazing and very popular location at the time. It was supposed to be, the second most popular resort in California at the time, and prominent families and diplomats, presidents, everybody would pass through, would actually stay there. And they list, Marilyn Monroe, Rita Hayworth, President Herbert Hoover. And it had a lot of entertainment too. It's like big bands would play there. So in 1951, it sold again. It changed hands again, and it again, homeland for gangsters, and other shady characters. There was rumors of all these secret passageways and hidden rooms and buried bodies, under the floorboards, and just throughout time, it started to become less and less glamorous, more and more seedy, more and more sort of this dark side. And this is also when they start to say that they had ghost sightings there. So especially in the Brook room, the Brook dining room, they started to report the sighting of the spectral figure of a 6-year-old girl who they thought was Sarah Logan, who was the niece of the original lodge owner who drowned in the dining room creek.
Ooh.
And they say that it is her ghost that is most seen at the Brookdale, and this is like this watery death that, again, you would think, well, sort of this beautiful natural stream, this indoor-outdoor thing, that sounds pretty good until, you have to get an insurance clause for it. So.
I mean, little kids in water, it's like,
right?
having a picnic at the beach. The seagulls are going to get there. The kids are going to fall into the river. That's just, you got to put up a gate.
Yeah, you got to put up a gate.
You got to put up a gate.
But, again, this is relatively early on. This is the 40s, the 50s is when this is coming in. It's not like, public safety within this type of thing is really closely monitored, probably.
Sure, yeah.
And then just, ongoing, there's all these stories that come up about, again, a 13-year-old girl who was drowned in, they had these huge kidney-shaped pools that you could actually sit, that had glass sides. So you'd sit in the bar and you could see people swimming. And then they would have mermaid shows at night. So they would have women dressed up as mermaids and going in and swimming. And it was called the Mermaid Room. And so mysteriously in the 70s, a girl, supposedly a 13-year-old girl, drowned in one of these pools, thus shutting down the Mermaid Room.
Wow. That's
yeah, right? So you have all these really, again, just, the sort of the 40s, the heyday, glamour. It's in this, pristine state. And then over time, going into the 70s, more and more, it changes hands more and more often. It gets more and more tales behind it. And I would say, like, in my brief investigation of this, really when you start to hear more of the stories coming into the paper and being much more publicized is in the 90s. And it's in about 1991 is when a lot more, I wouldn't say a lot more, but definitely the focus of media is starting to pay more attention to the Brookdale. And you have, I think, like Ghost Catcher series and a lot of other Discovery channels going and, interviewing and bringing in their spectrometers or whatever, their EMF reading and starting to like try and find out what's going on. So I have a little bit more to the story as well, but that's just a start. And I would say like that's led all the way up to the 1990s. And in the 1990s, late 90s, there was a fire that was actually, they've determined was arson at the time for insurance. And since then it has, it shut down, and now has been repurchased and is going through sort of another renaissance. The new owner is putting a lot of money back into it and trying to bring it up to its original state.
Interesting, man.
Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, it sounds like a cool place to eat, but not necessarily swim. Evidently, I mean, not a great swimming track record. Mike, what do you got?
Well, like Marie's, my story also involves a hotel. This one is in Austin, Texas. It's called the Driscoll Hotel, and it is relatively famous for being haunted. In particular, room 525 of the Driscoll Hotel. This is a very sort of a Shining type story. Room 525 is supposed to be haunted by what they call the suicide brides. And two different women, 20 years apart, both died in the bathtub of room 525, both by committing suicide. Supposedly, according to the most versions of the story, because their fiance jilted them at the last moment. And there was an incident, a specific incident in 1999, where that particular floor was being renovated, and there were two ladies staying in the Driscoll Hotel. And they knew of the story, or they had heard some pieces of the story, and they wanted to go and, just be curious and go see at least the fifth floor and maybe the door of room 525. And so the floors were off limits because of the renovations. So they decided to sneak onto the fifth floor and have a look. And so they take the elevator up to the sixth floor or one of the other floors, and they get off, and then they just go down the stairs. And when they get to the fifth floor, it's the whole, you can tell that it's being renovated. There's plastic hanging down. There's all sorts of clutter and stuff involved in the renovation work. And they look down the hall towards where the room is, and they're surprised to see a woman walking away from them down the hall. And the woman is carrying bags in both of her hands. And she stops in front of one of the rooms and turns and faces the room, and they can see her standing there, and she reaches for the door. And one of the ladies yells down to her, "Hey, doesn't it bother you staying on a floor with all this work going on?" And they said the woman answered them, "Not at all," and then walked into the room. And so later on, they go downstairs to the lobby, and they're talking to someone that works at the hotel. And they tell them that, "Hey, we kind of went on to the fifth floor, and there's a woman that's staying there. I thought those floors were closed." And they said, "There's no one staying on the fifth floor. It's completely shut down for the renovations." And they said, "Well, there's someone there because we saw them." And I guess they started arguing about it. And the manager or the person that they're talking to says, well, why don't we go see? And so he gets the keys, and they go up to the fifth floor, and they walk down to the door where they had seen this woman enter. And the manager unlocks the door, and they swing the door open, and the room is completely a mess because they're working on it. There's no way that anyone is staying in this room. And so the story goes that there's one story, one of the brides, I don't really know the story, but the other one was fairly specific in that a woman was staying there. She was engaged. Her fiance had called off the wedding at the last minute. And so she had gone shopping in Austin and then had come back to the hotel, her arms loaded down with shopping bags, and then gone into the room and undressed and took a pillow from the bed and then went into the bathroom next to the bathtub and put the pillow over her hand and shot herself in the stomach. And then collapsed into the bathtub. And that was how she was found. So it's interesting on one level because the story connects, at least symbolically, with the idea of water, in that both of the ghosts were supposedly connected to bathtubs within the hotel. But the hotel itself is also connected to water because it's built on top of a natural artesian well. And in fact, prior to the hotel being there, it was the site of a bathhouse in Austin. So it was a public bath. And then even before Austin existed, the well was a stopping place for travelers who were moving through that part of the country. And, even going back to before there were, white settlers there, when it was just Native Americans, that particular well was thought to have spiritual significance. And it was considered to be a sacred place by the Native Americans who would stop there because it's an arid country. And so as a source of water, and on top of that, especially a source of water that was considered to have spiritual or religious significance, it was a place that people would would come to from a variety of tribes. And their belief at the time was that there was a connection between spirits and water, and that the water contained spirits, both spirits that were living inside the well willingly and spirits that had somehow become trapped there. And their belief was that if people were to live there, they didn't believe in living there. That was just a place they would come to in their travels and then leave. They believed that it was not necessarily smart to live there, because if you lived in the presence of spirits, if the spirits became unhappy, then they could actually harm people. And interestingly enough, in 1885, which is when the foundation for the Driscoll Hotel was laid, that same year is when a series of infamous murders, in fact, what is considered to be the first series of serial killings that we know of in the United States, called the Servant Girl Annihilator murders, began the exact same year that the foundation was laid for the Driscoll, on top of this artesian well.
Wow.
And those murders, which I think it was maybe 8 people that were murdered, but a total of something like 10 that were attacked with an axe in a number of cases. But I mean, just brutal murders. And they went from December of 1884, when they began, to December of 1885, when the last 2 murders occurred. But I've always found that kind of interesting, that there is this, when we first started talking about the idea of a connection between ghosts and water, which is not really something that I'd ever thought about before, this particular location immediately sprang to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only, like I said, not only of the connection in terms of bathtubs and suicides, and which is just instantly creepy because it reminds me of The Shining.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
but also because there's this sort of deeper, literally and figuratively, deeper connection between water and hauntings and that location, which goes back possibly centuries.
Yeah,
That's creepy.
That's a very good one. I am glad we had you on to tell that. That is a good one, man.
What is it with, like, the thing I love is, like, the specificity. Like, mine has a hotel room as well. Like, there's got to be a specific room, right, to make it real. And just even to tie it back to, to Stephen King, to The Shining. It's like you get room whatever, It's like that's definitely where, like the origin of a lotus or whatever it is of, that the energy is coming from for the narrative. It's so creepy. It's so creepy.
Right. Well, I think there's something to the idea that, so actually, what in the Mike story of the Driscoll, the idea of there being this well, this area of oasis, a refuge in this dangerous and scary world that, that frankly we even still to this day kind of live in. But water is one of those things you can't live without, right? So I think there is something to be said about this idea of not only like transience of traveling and then finding a place of refuge like a hotel room, and also like a river or like a well, or a source of clear water where you could rest and wait and hopefully regain your strength and then continue on your journey. But also the idea of this is literally where people would have been most likely to exist for the vast majority of human history, right? I mean, if ghosts do exist, then doesn't it make sense that they would be most likely where the most people have been, right? And before we had running water and irrigation and things, that was near water sources, right? So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Something that I was thinking about when we were talking about this subject, or at least thinking about this subject for this episode, was that the medium in which ghosts exist, which is inarguable. I mean, there's no debate. The medium in which ghosts absolutely do exist is in stories.
Absolutely.
And the place where you find stories is obviously the place where you find people, where people gather and stay for periods of time. And of course, what is the one characteristic common to every place that people live? And that's water.
100%.
So there, there's at least an indirect connection there, definitely, between ghost stories and water, because ghost stories are going to crop up where the people are. The people are always going to be where the water is.
Yeah, so actually, a topic that I wanted to do for this episode, but then I thought is going to end up being its own whole thing for us, anyways, is the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts. And the Bridgewater Triangle is kind of, it's one of those places that it's like a buffet of paranormal things. You got Bigfoot, you got UFOs, you got, orbs, you got ghosts, you got devils and all kinds of good stuff. But one part of that legend that I think is kind of a motif, I guess, that we see consistently is the idea of a water source that has been poisoned, or a water source that has been cursed in some way. And whenever I hear stories like that, there's this thing in evolutionary biology called a just so story. And what that is it's kind of like, thunder is God bowling, right? It's that kind of story where things are the way that they are because the universe is perfect and, everything is just so, right? And not only that, but everything works logically. There are no leaps in imagination or leaps in thinking. So an example of that in evolutionary biology would be, why do guys at parties play guitar? They play guitar because guitar playing is for some reason attractive to females, and that will lead to more procreation, and therefore it's better for their genes, and yada yada yada, right? It's used as these kind of like hand wavy ways to make evolution fit anyone's preconceived notions. And one kind of just so story that I actually think there is something to is the idea that stories of hauntings or stories of, and this wouldn't necessarily be a just so story. It's almost more of like an anthropological hypothesis, I suppose. Maybe hypothesis is too strong a word, but yeah, that's like I get mad at people when they say
pull that one out. Nice.
Yeah, when they say the ancient alien hypothesis, I'm like, no, but now here I am using it for not my own field. But whatever. There's an anthropologist somewhere ready to flip this table over that they're sitting at. But the idea that this water source is haunted is a really good way to keep people from drinking dirty water that causes them to get sick and die. Right? So the idea that some of these water sources maybe were really dangerous for people, and the way that they had to explain it was, well, in the distant past, some evil tribe or some evil god or something came and said, those who live in this area and drink from this water are going to die. And it did happen. They would die because of the amoebas or whatever was in the water. But, it wasn't magic. It was diarrhea, which, as is often the case with magic.
Which is really what we should have called this. We should call this.
Which is,
the thing of it is, I can tell you this. I mean, because I'm basically in the business of oral traditions.
Yeah,
oral stories.
totally.
So, I mean, it's been my experience that the guy doesn't even have to die when he drinks from the well. He could drink from the well and then just coincidentally he gets a stomach ache. And by the time that story has passed through 6 other people, he's dead.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And the well is cursed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way stories work is that in order to survive orally, stories have to become more interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And in order to keep going. And so they get more, they get more interesting as they go. Otherwise, people stop telling them.
Well,
sure.
I think one of the things that's really awesome too is you always like the ghosts are more often than not a jilted bride, right? She was left on her wedding day, or a child, right? Child looking for its parents or looking for its mother. I mean, you could get the outlier of the guy with the axe, or something that's a little bit more menacing. But with this type of story, and even with the hotels, I feel like you see that again and again and again, right? It's like it's always something, it's always something in those veins that, again, it's like who paid the punishment, or what is sort of the cost of bad water, or what is the cost that is incurred that's going to be taken from the society, is the idea of children, or procreation, or of a future, kind of, in some ways.
Well,
if you want to look at it almost in sort of that,
yeah. Well, I think there's a cool, so one idea that's kind of been consistent, I would say, in the history of, consistent maybe is too strong, again, too strong a damn word, but the idea of ghosts in some way being, maybe not residue necessarily, but ghostly apparitions being caused by moments of extreme stress, right? And that's true even if we get away from just pure ghostly encounters. There is, I think, definitely an archetype for the kind of person you expect to be magical, or the kind of person you expect to be able to do things out of the ordinary, right? It's for a long time it was old women, right? Were thought to be in some way, because how did they survive that long? Right? Right? I mean, their husbands died. That's a little bit weird.
Survive that long?
There's a little bit of that, and then there's also, I think, something to the idea of children, like you were saying, Marie, but specifically young women seem to consistently be brought up in these things. You look at Poltergeist, right? I mean, every Poltergeist story has a young girl in it somehow or some way.
Corpse
right? And they
bride.
always, well, yeah, right? Or a bride, or a woman who dies at this kind of, I think, what was supposed to be throughout previous history. And I'm even saying, like, back in the 90s, like, the day of marriage was, like, supposed to be the day, right? It was like, and so then to be betrayed on that day in some way, or
it's the big archetype. It's a huge, even Disney. I mean, even the Haunted Mansion cashes in on the haunted bride, right? On the bride who offed her husbands, or who is cursed to, something has happened on that day, and that's the reliving of it constantly. It's like,
sure.
It's excellent, especially I think when you put that with hotels, and then you do have it tied in with water. It resonates even more.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me get to my story finally. Mine is about Sailor's Snug Harbor, which is on Staten Island, New York, the part of New York City that I grew up on.
Shout out Staten Island!
Shout out Staten Island! Let's go Dolphins! It's the local college's very scary
chess
animal.
Team. Excellent chess team.
Excellent chess team. So the
nationally ranked.
Marie, how did you know I was a chess nerd in high school? How did you know that?
Shut it.
Oh my goodness.
Well, when you were with AV and Dungeons and Dragons, I was figuring we would have a chess team.
Oh, sure, yeah. So Sailor's Snug Harbor is really fascinating, and actually Staten Island has a lot of haunted places, considering how I don't know, I guess small. It seemed small to me growing up because I grew up there, but now being in other places, like the entirety of St. Paul has the same, or the Twin Cities have the same population size as Staten Island, New York, which is just it's the smallest of the 5 boroughs, I think, in population size. So pretty fascinating. But anyways, Staten Island seems to have a lot of these kind of haunted places, and when I was growing up, there were places that you knew supposedly were haunted, and one of them was Snug Harbor. The other one was what's known as the Boat Graveyard, which was fascinating. I have always heard that it was haunted. I could never hear, there was never anything specific, but it was always like, there's like man with a hooked hand or whatever there. You know what I mean? Like, it was always
They need something with annihilation in it. Like, I like that one from the other story. It's a bride annihilation, sailor annihilation, something like that to kind of get to jumpstart it.
Yeah. So this story about Snug Harbor. So Snug Harbor, officially called Sailor's Snug Harbor, was it's a beautiful piece of land and home and cottages and things, like a big complex of things in New York City on Staten Island. And it's on the north shore of Staten Island, kind of right across the water from Jersey. And so it has all kinds of different, historical connections and things, but it's very, very interesting. It began, or was it at one point in time, a a home for sailors, for sailors who had retired, I guess. And there are all kinds of ghost stories and things associated with that even idea of a sailor who, never got to go back home or never really had a home in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's I think quite fascinating. So this is a quote from a description of it. It was an institution to care for aged, decrepit, and worn out seamen. So quite an enticing sounding thing if you're an old sailor. They're like, "Are you decrepit
No
and worn
romanticizing
out?"
that. Yep.
No, they're just like, these are all for all the stinky sailors out there. Come to Snug Harbor. So there's a lot of different ghostly sightings that occur on the grounds of Snug Harbor. One of which is a woman a woman and a child occasionally who you see coming up a staircase at the matron's cottage, which is on the grounds of the Snug Harbor. And so the matron's cottage is where the kind of the head woman, the female staff would live, who took care of the sailors at the residence. And so the rumor is that the matron, the head of the household, had an affair with someone, a groundsman or a sailor or something, and had a child that was illegitimate. And to keep her secret and continue with her job, the son was kept in the basement of Snug Harbor, kind of, in a prison of sorts, chained up and everything until he was 13 years old. At which point, at the age of 13, he escaped and killed his mother. So this kind of puts together all the stories of the bride and the illegitimate son and the dog. Yeah, that old chestnut. Boy turns 13. Boy escapes basement dungeon. Boy kills mother. That old chestnut. So supposedly, then he was found. He was then found hiding in the woods and was hung in a tree behind the matron's home. Now there is no actual evidence for this story being true. But there is another murder that occurred here, a relatively famous one. This is from the New York Times, 1863. I'm going to read this in my best old-timey reporter voice. Murder-suicide on Staten Island. The chaplain of the Sailors' Snug Harbor shot and instantly killed by an inmate of that institution. Court of General Sessions before Judge McGunn. At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, a most atrocious homicide was committed at the Sailors' Snug Harbor, Staten Island, under the following circumstances. The chaplain of the institution, the Reverend Robert A. Quinn, had been holding religious services in the Sailors' Chapel and was on his return home when a sailor named Herman Ingalls, who was standing near the corner of the main building, confronted him, saying, "You'll expose me. I know you will if you live," and immediately drew from his breast pocket a double-barreled pistol and fired at Mr. Quinn. The ball entered his left breast immediately under the heart, and after reeling for a few seconds, Mr. Quinn dropped dead, exclaiming, "I'm shot! I'm shot!" The sailor then turned around, placed the pistol close to the side of his own head, discharged the remaining barrel, and fell. The shot tore away his entire lower jaw. Now that actually happened. Yeah, it's intense, right? And so,
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting about this part of New York is that Staten Island is kind of fascinating, I think, for a lot of interesting reasons. The joke was back in I guess the 60s, 50s, all the way to like the late 90s, was Staten Island was where you went to dump your mob hits. If you couldn't get to the Gowanus to dump them there, you went to Staten Island and threw them away, either at the ginormous dump, which is what we were most famous for, or in the woods someplace. And Staten Island is also, I think, fascinating because of It's a small island. There's all these little rivers and things that run through, and it can be legitimately terrifying, or it was legitimately terrifying for me as a kid. You know, you never knew. I mean, mostly terrifying because you never
Jawless
knew.
sailors, ghosts of
Yeah.
jawless sailors
Yeah.
wandering around.
So I love that story. I actually really like. There's a lot of cool ghost stories about Staten Island. Maybe someday we'll do a whole episode on them. I've got plenty of books on it out there, but yeah. So this one is kind of connected to water in almost a kind of a circular way, I suppose. It's a sailor. They live on an island.
No, I mean, but it's a proxy, right? Like you could still
Yeah.
like all of the haunted, the ghost ships, the Bermuda Triangle, all of that stuff I would lump into the hauntings near water. I think it's yeah. I mean, there's no getting away from it, and I think that one was. I love the vivid detail and the old timey voice.
Yeah,
Very
it
nicely
kind of fell away at the end, but yeah.
I think you were like, oh my god, that's right. He lost his.
It gets a
jaw.
little serious
Lovely.
at the end. Yeah. So here's the thing. One thing that I really like about this idea of running water specifically in ghost stories is the idea that a ghost is an imprint left behind on the physical world in some way. And so the energy of the water, like the kinetic energy of the water molecules actually flowing, is enough in some way to store the ghost behind, the ghost's memory. Or I've even heard it. I have heard it explained to me in this way as well, where it's almost like the water itself acts as a recording device, almost like a magnetic recording strip on a tape player tape. Or I mean, even if you just want to get as as kind of binary as you can think of it, the river in some way holds the psychic energy, and you, I mean, Marie, I hate psychic energy with a passion, but it kind of it holds it back. Chemtrails. It holds it back in some way, and then allows it to be repeated when the conditions are just right. So the same emotional.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, right?
So I will say the second part of my story really quickly is going back, doing the research, doing more reading into it. Both of these instances of the deaths with water are completely fictitious, is what I found. That there is no historical record of it. There's no record of anyone drowning actually at the lodge. There's no record of a niece or a daughter, dying, or any of those circumstances, or the idea of a 13-year-old drowning in the swimming pool actually just did not happen. So they think that was mostly created from going into the 1990s to actually help drum up more business for
that's funny.
the hotel. However, the interesting thing that does tie back into what you were saying is this hotel has just, it was built up as, sort of this man-made enclave and refuge in this huge redwood forest. And I feel like it has the worst run of luck, and nature has just sort of torn it down. Like even going back in and trying to refurb it. So the new owners who bought it in the early 2000s, they still don't have it. I think it just recently opened, and it was years and years behind on schedule just because of all the torrential weather and the fact that you really can't build a very stable foundation around running water. It just is not going. It's not built to last.
Sure, yeah.
So I think that there's something about kind of that in with this as well. It's like even if you don't have the actual, vision or apparition, you have something that is going to be fighting with you. That's almost going to be haunting you, regardless. That you're not going to be able to sustain, which is how I like to look at the hotel.
Well,
sorry, buzz killer. But
well, it's interesting too, because as somebody was saying earlier, the idea of these stories of children drowning in the water, it it carries this sort of inherent warning in the story.
Yeah.
This message that children should stay away from the water, and it carries it in a way that children would be more likely to take it seriously than if it was just an adult saying stay away from the water.
Right. You know,
Right.
those stories always remind me of everyone in middle school knew a kid who actually got his head chopped off by sticking his head out the bus window. Right? Like everyone knew that
The
kid,
roller coaster.
supposedly.
Stood up
Right,
on the roller coaster.
yeah,
man.
stood up on the roller coaster and head chopped right off or whatever.
That'll do it.
So one thing actually that I think is good, I guess, kind of a segue into this next part of the discussion, I suppose, is so what we often like to talk about, kind of I guess, I suppose it's something that we've now borrowed from Astonishing Legends, because Forrest has these things called the rules, right? And they're these kind of catch-all things where, you know, they seem to carry out throughout whatever paranormal thing you're talking about. They seem to be consistent, right? So probably the one that's most often touched on in Astonishing Legends, at least, is evil or dark things can't come into your home. You have to invite them in, right? So you have the story of like the black-eyed children who they knock on the door and are like, you know, could we come in? And, you know, if you say no, they don't. Or vampires, the same thing was true. You know, or spirits on All Hallows Eve or whatever. There's these stories about the power of permission, right? And on top of that comes this idea of getting something's names. For some reason, the proper name of something seems to hold power. But one that I think is often overlooked is the power of running water. So, for instance, with vampires, one of the ways to stop a vampire from coming back or to keep it away from you is to put running water between you and the vampire, right? So,
Really?
yeah, running water is one of the. It's so funny. If you just kind of built a moat around Dracula's castle, you'd be super well, so long as it was flowing, I guess.
It had a
But-
moat.
It didn't have a moat.
Dracula's
No, it did have a
castle had a
moat.
moat. It had a moat.
Oh wait, it totally had a moat because he had to climb
totally had
down
a
the
moat.
cliff or whatever.
Had a moat.
Oh damn it! Well,
Boom.
whatever. It's got to be running water.
Humanity's majored.
So the whole thing was like, so for instance, in the book, they had to transport Dracula had to be put onto a ship in his coffin, right? He had to be, the ship had to come over to the United Kingdom. He could not travel there himself under his own power. And it's true. This shows up again and again in the stories of you know, Romania and Ukraine and Poland and stuff, where if you want to make sure that a revenant can't come back or a vampire or something, you chop off their head, you bury the head on an island, and then you can burn the body, right? And that way they definitely can't go back. They're never coming back. I was wondering, well, first off, Mike, I think that's just an interesting tidbit, I suppose, but I was wondering.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mention it because, and I'm amazed this didn't occur to me before, but there's actually a very specific tradition exactly along those lines in Charleston. There is a certain color of blue that it used to be more common in the African American community here, especially out on the barrier islands and the sea islands on the coast, where you had populations that had kind of been isolated to some extent from people that lived on the mainland. And there was this tradition of painting windows and door frames with a certain color of blue. And it's called haint blue, Haint, haint blue. And the belief was that the blue of the paint would symbolize running water, and that evil spirits wouldn't be able to pass through the windows or the doors as long as they were protected in that blue paint, because it would effectively ward them off. It's sort of like an updated version of the biblical account where they would paint the lamb's blood above the doorway when the angel of death was passing through. So that's exactly sort of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now you'll still see the color of paint now. It's more decorative now than anything, but it had a very specific purpose when it was originally used.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. You know, it does remind me of the, like you said, with the religious the religious kind of connotations to it as well. It's an important symbol. Water is in Catholicism and Christianity, right? I mean, you have holy water, and the idea of baptism is cleaning the spirit and the body in water, the cleaning of feet. All that stuff is important in some symbolic way, and kind of water is thought to be this just a general like cleansing, purifying thing. So one thing that we always talk about, it's kind of, I guess, our addendum to the rules of Forest, I suppose, or maybe we're making our own rules, Marie.
Oh, we just ripped them off. It's fine. Keep going.
We rip them off. It's our own damn rule.
They didn't trademark them. We're fine.
It's that these paranormal, like, if you want to be able to tell if a thing is like a mythology or just kind of a story, even a modern day story that we continue to tell ourselves, versus something that's based in fact or science or however you want to, materialism, however you want to describe it, is that paranormal or magical stories or ideas don't actually change. They just kind of, like, they don't change in their underlying, I guess, moral or story. They just change their shape almost. And one version of that I actually think is really interesting is the idea that water in some way attracts UFOs. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this.
No.
So I'm a big
No.
Okay, so I'm a big UFO nerd. I find that it's like our modern day mythology. I absolutely love it, but it's this idea that for some reason, again, they're drawn. These crafts or lights or whatever people are seeing are drawn to running water for some reason, and it's one of those things where I always find a correlation to the idea, like I had brought up earlier in the episode, where of a meeting place or a crossroads or a central point where people gather before they go on their way, right? And that's actually another one of those rules, it seems like, if you go through the history of these stories and things, is evil stuff or paranormal things seem to happen at crossroads. They seem to happen at areas where people converge. And whether or not that's because there's just more people there, so your chances are higher, or there is some, like, I don't know, psychological reason or something.
It's
but,
like the...
Well, also...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, crossroads in itself is a very symbolic place, because inherently a crossroads implies that you are at a place where you have to make a choice between going one way or the other way.
Yeah, but there's something there that's going to take you off your path.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there, with choices also comes the idea that there are consequences, that you can make bad choices. So it's that's really interesting. But I think it's what better place for stories like that than a crossroads.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely something to the idea, like you were saying earlier, where these stories, whether or not they're, like, I actually think it's kind of interesting that, Marie, your stories had no historical fact. They just seem to be stories that these people were telling to bring in tourists, right? You can see that happening in the past too, right? Like, we're the inn with the haunted hay mattress. Come for a pint and see the haunted chamber pot, right? Like that. How do you fill the seats? You gotta get people in the seats,
right?
But
I'm sure that people have, after these stories also saw things. Like, it's self-substantiating,
sure.
right? Like, if you start to say that this is the ghost of the little girl was seen here, I mean, I think that's natural. You're going to start to have more occurrences. But then the weird question is, like, chicken and egg. Well, then, are you seeing something, or are you thinking that you're seeing something? I mean, that's
right.
Well, it's the difference going through my head with this.
Absolutely. I think like what you were saying, it's the difference between having a dream about a little girl in whatever, a ghostly apparition or something in your own house, and being like, well, my house was built in 2012. I don't think anyone's died here yet. Versus in a hotel room that's supposedly haunted, and suddenly that dream holds special significance until you remember it. Yeah, that's actually really, really interesting. So I kind of want to move on to the next segment here, where Mike, I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions that have been on my mind.
Sure.
But before we go, anyone got any last things on ghosts in water?
No, but I'm looking for the place with the haunted chamber pot.
So I actually, Marie, looked up loganberries after you said it. He did invent loganberries by accident.
He invented them? How do you invent a loganberry? Like, what is a loganberry? I didn't want to get too into it because I didn't want to sound ignorant. I don't know what a loganberry is.
This is from the Wikipedia page. This is a sentence that I really like. Mm-hmm. Logan was unsatisfied with the existing varieties of blackberries and tried crossing 2 varieties of blackberries to produce a superior cultivar. So this man was eating breakfast one day and was like, you know what? I am unsatisfied with these blackberries. And he just put 2 plants next to each other, and they accidentally invented a whole new type of berry.
But isn't that the 1870s? Is like you have some guy who's like, you know what? You know what? I am these plebeian berries. I can, I shall rise above this with science, and I now will, I will tame this redwood forest, and I will build a sprawling Swiss chalet, and I shall even make my own berries and name them after myself. I mean, that's a pretty good origin story for a downfall. It's almost like a little bit of hubris.
Science run amok.
I wonder how that works as a pickup line.
I made my own berries.
I invented the loganberry.
And then you get smacked. I don't know where this is going, but I don't like it, sir. Ridiculous. All right. Well, let's get into this quick. We have been talking for an hour so far. Mike, I had a couple of listening to your show. It's a treat and honor to have you here. So I just wanted to get a couple of quick questions thrown at you here.
Sure.
So I'm really fascinated. What would you say is the thing that you are in this whole spooky realm of stuff that we kind of talk about on our shows? What would you say is the thing that you're the most skeptical of and the least skeptical of?
The thing that I am most skeptical of are the people like you see on TV that supposedly can talk to the dead.
Oh yeah.
I don't know why, especially since I tell ghost stories of the living, you would think that I would be more tolerant of that sort of thing. But I don't know, that just rubs me the wrong way for some reason. I guess because if you tell someone a ghost story, they can believe it, they cannot believe it, they can like it, they don't like it. There's no harm.
Yeah.
But when you're going to someone who's in pain because they've lost a loved one, and you're in my opinion, just basically, making stuff up. To me that just seems inherently harmful, and it rubs me.
Yeah, I think Marie, I'm sure you too. I think we're 100% on the same side on that one, man. It's one of those things where, so it's actually kind of funny. Whenever Katie really likes one of those shows, and I'm not going to say which one because I don't know if she actually is a powerful.
My wife loves one of those shows.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if she's a powerful warlock or not, but
Katie,
whenever it comes on, I will say to Katie and Jess that she's supporting necromancy, because technically that is what necromancy is talking to the dead. So they should call the show world's best necromancer or something. Then I'd watch it, probably be a little bit more badass. But I think we often get into these, like, I don't want to say like existential questions with ourselves, but almost like, as someone this show specifically we're trying to like promote scientific thinking by talking about these stories and how pseudoscience morphs into science, but still leaves behind pseudoscience, right? And
right.
But there are topics like with like climate change. Say we had some of the people that do research for us were like, well, why don't you have someone on who doesn't think that it's happening? And while that might be entertaining, I don't know if it's fruitful. I don't know if it's good.
Because we'd probably want to slap them.
Well, besides that, it's like giving it's giving a place for someone who's not arguing in good faith. You know, I have no problem with someone saying that they don't believe in something that I believe in, but I would hope that they're coming at it from a place that we can at least agree to disagree at the end, you know? So anyway, so what's the thing that you believe the most then?
Well, when I first started giving ghost tours 20 years ago, right before I started doing it, I didn't know if I could do it because I was like, I don't know if I really believe in ghosts. But over the years, there have been so many really weird things that have happened. And really, so many people that I've talked to that have talked about things that have happened to them, that I would say that it's kind of put me in a position of saying, it seems like there's something going on here and I don't know what it is.
Sure.
But there's something here that's weird that I can't explain. And, it's easy to dismiss people individually or in small numbers, but when over a 20-year period, when you have, hundreds and hundreds of people that have, normal people too, I mean, not, crazy people, but just average people that'll talk about, these things that have happened to them, it becomes very convincing. And then, for example, on the ghost tour itself, there is one location, one specific spot on the ghost tour that since 2013, 15 people have collapsed on the tour when they stood in that particular place.
Oh, we're doing that.
And
Chris, get the van. Go get the van, man.
It is, and at first I'm like, okay, that's just a weird isolated incident. And then it happened again and again and again and again, and all different times of year.
Can you tell us what spot it is?
No, don't tell. No, if he tells it, it ruins the experiment, Marie.
I know I'm poisoning the control group, but now I just
we're guinea pigs now. No, Mike can tell us.
But it's interesting. It's interesting because people on the tour will question it, and they will say, "Yeah, but this happened after you told the story." And I would say, yeah, it's usually almost always happens after I've told them that people passed out, and then we go over there and somebody passes out. And then last September, this past September, I was literally telling people the story, and there was another ghost tour standing at that particular spot across the street. And I turn around to see if they're moving on yet or if they're still there. And one of the ladies in the other group passes out.
Oh my God.
So I was like, okay, so that's a point in that favor.
Oh, wow.
So there's just weird stuff like that, which I can't explain. And as I talked about, we have a haunted jail here, and I spent the night alone inside of it. I mean, and that was a very scary experience. And that's just one of those things. It doesn't matter how skeptical you are. That will test your fortitude.
Sure.
Just being alone in a super creepy place, especially when you're very familiar with the history and somebody was murdered on that spot or somebody was tortured in that room. It really is intense.
Yeah, no, sure. We'll skip that one, but definitely the tour.
Skip
the camp out in the haunted jail.
Right, it's the home with all the pillows just hanging around just in case. Man, that's really interesting. So, wow, I really do kind of want to know where it is, but I also really so I have a cousin who lives in South Carolina. He's always inviting me to come down. And so I'm hoping to get down there soon. So when I come down, man, I'm definitely coming on one of your tours.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go back to your earlier question. Another thing that I'm not a big fan of is, and people ask me about it all the time, are like the ghost hunting.
Oh, that was my next question was going to be, what do you think?
Big fan of that. Yeah.
So one thing that we always talk about is kind of the progression of. So there's a pretty set pattern that things take, or seems to be a relatively set pattern that things kind of take, where way back they were pure magic, right? There was no, and by magic I mean there's no there's no like natural causal chain explanation, right? So it's not like, okay, this is because of, I don't know, temperature and pressure or whatever. It's like, this is because there's a demon in the room with us. And over time, as science gets better, people that believe in this thing try to use science to probe it and kind of measure it and quantify it and stuff. And over time, it chips away from what the idea originally was, and you end up with something. You either end up disproving the original idea or it morphs in some way. And so the perfect example of that I always talk about is witchcraft. Witchcraft went from being something completely mysterious and unknowable, and demons were just as powerful and the devil was just as powerful and magical as God, and so there was no way you could ever understand them, to a slow eroding over time of, well, actually nothing can be, nothing could be greater than the theoretical God, and so therefore they must be natural things. And then witches were using natural methods to do their magic, and then all the way down until finally it became the case, well, there really aren't any witches. There's poison and there's, herbal healing and stuff, but that's just science now. And so what happened is the witch went from being a powerful idea to a completely powerless idea with no reality really in it. And then people just took those same stories, and now instead of a witch coming to your home and abducting you out of your bed at night, it's an alien, right? Or it's a shadow person or a black-eyed kid or something. Like, these same stories continue. And so while the ancient alien people would say, well, that's just proof that aliens have always been here, in my mind, it's like, well, what if it's witches still? It's this. There is, the whole point is that there's no real evidence, and then once you get to evidence, you ruin it. And so for ghost hunting, I feel like the same thing's kind of happening, where ghosts went from being this like romantic, interesting, like a Harry Potter style kind of ghost thing, right? Where it was a life after this life, and you wandered about and you could talk to the living and change things if you wanted and whatever, to now where they're just electrons that we're measuring with a EMF reader,
Right.
So what? So,
well, yeah, it ruins it. Well, first of all, and I think it irks me. I mean, I don't have a scientific bone in my body, honestly, but it irks me anyways to call what you see there science, because
Sure.
there's just like, I mean, who's to say, because they just make up all of these, they have all these assumptions, and there's like no basis for it really. I mean, that any of these gadgets actually work, or that they're measuring the right thing, or that what they're measuring, what that means. I mean, there's no way to know any of it. It's just it's all just, they've sort of cobbled together these assumptions and these rules, and it doesn't. There's nothing to say that it works. But I think you're exactly right. I think it. I love ghost stories, but it ruins the ghost story when you reduce the ghost to, well, I got a spike on my EMF meter. That must mean there's a ghost here. When
it's overly explained too. I think it's like that takes so much out of any good ghost story. It's when you see too much of the monster itself in so many ways. Like, I hate to put it back into film, but it's like, what was great about Jaws? What's great about any good horror film? Like, right. The less you see of it, the more mystery it has to it, the more imagination, the more you put into it instead of it putting into you. And when you're sort of buying in and having your imagination build out what that fear is, it's so much more convincing than, it being a mechanical shark.
I think there's also something to the idea of, for example, like this was actually something I was thinking when, Marie, you said that there was no real, historical evidence for this story, at this, this inn or the hotel. I keep trying to think of what the actual name was, but I keep Babbling Brook Inn.
Yeah, the Brookdale. Okay. The Brookdale,
all right,
Lodge.
Brookdale Lodge. Oh my goodness,
Brookdale
I'm gonna
Lodge.
get so many bad emails from them, I'm sure. But but like the idea that if it was very specific, then people that have an experience there, like having it be nebulous and open means that there's more chance for people to have an experience in the sense, right? In the sense of, oh, I didn't, I asked the ghost on my EMF or on my whatever EVP thing what his name was, and he said his name was Brian, but a Brian never lived here, and it's like, well, I mean, yeah, like, I don't know. I think
I agree with you, and I think you have to have enough tenets to kind of get the story set in some ways. Like it helps, it's like, okay, what is the again, the archetype of the ghost, or the thing that is the haunting, and where is it being seen, and who's seeing it, and even, again, like, I like the addition of the room number, because I do feel like there's certain places, especially in hotels, there's always one room or one place that has more activity than others, and that has a story behind it. So I feel like you have to have those things, but you also have to have it be fluid enough that you buy into it, that you still have a creative or sort of an imaginary or an imaginative tie to it.
It has to be credible.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
It has to have
well,
enough
what I was going to
information
say
to have that story, though. Yeah.
What I was going to say, though, was, for me, some of the most convincing pieces of ghostly evidence, I suppose, or evidence of hauntings or whatever, are not those cases where it's very specific and, like, it's times where it's almost more like the Amityville Horror style kind of motif, I guess, where it's a feeling that just builds and builds and it's an uneasiness or an anxiety, or this place doesn't feel right. I don't know why, but this place doesn't feel right. To me, that, although none of it has a physical basis per se that I can think of, that idea of there just being like a bad feeling, or this area is not safe for some reason, we feel like it's not safe. That, to me, those are the kind of things that I find the most compelling, I guess. I don't know.
I'm with you.
Well, I mentioned earlier that jail that I spent the night in.
Yeah.
The right before everyone left me alone in it, they had a tour going through, and I was in the room with this tour group, and there was a teenage girl in the group, and everybody's just standing there while the person is talking. And all of a sudden, this teenage girl starts screaming and grabbing her leg and just jumping up and down. And her mother takes her into another room and comes back, and the teenage girl had 3 scratch marks down the inside of her leg, from her thigh to her ankle. 3 scratch marks all the way down the inside of her leg. Her mother even took photographs. And that you have that kind of thing happen, and you're just like, okay, maybe there's an explanation for this, but it just happened right in front of me, and I can't think of what the explanation for this could be.
Let's get out the hot cocoa and the sleeping bag.
Especially since there's like a history of that happening.
Yeah, well,
at that location, and that was one that I was like, huh.
Oh,
the thing that I
hell no. Hell no.
The thing that I find most interesting about that, though, too, and this is something that I tell people all the time about, people will say to me, like, oh, you have all these books on, like, if you come into my apartment, there's one room where it's all drawings of, like, what we used to think animals looked like. So it's all like really bad drawings of like monkeys and boars and stuff. And then there's another room where it's just like alien pictures and drawings of ghosts and like lithograph. And we have a bunch of our house is weirdly decorated, I would say. But people, when they come over, are always like, oh, are you into like ghosts or, UFOs or whatever and stuff. And inevitably we end up talking about that the whole time. But one thing that I find fascinating about that is people who will say to me, well, do you really think any of it is real? And to me, that there is, like you were saying before, the only thing I know for sure is that these stories are real, right? That these people, like maybe some of these people are making things up, whatever. But in cases like what you were just saying, where we trust you, you were in a room and you saw someone's leg get scratched, that what if the mind can do that, that is still an infinitely interesting and terrifying thing to investigate.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the reality of what it was to me is a interesting part, but it would almost be scarier if your brain could just do that to you sometimes on its own. You know, for no reason. Like at least if it's a ghost, you can, I don't know, put a river around you in the ghost or whatever. You know?
I might not be able to understand it, or maybe I don't fully believe it. But that doesn't mean I'm not scared of it, right? I mean, it's like, if I see something like that, I'm like, you know what? We're going to calling it
Right.
now. I don't need to believe it to realize I am experiencing fear. I've got the fight or flight, and I'm going to listen to that, and we're going to leave.
Sure.
And, you know, I'll just go get a beer someplace.
Well, one of the
that's-
things.
Yeah, haunted. Yeah, no. Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that I kind of have struggled with is that because I've given lectures on telling ghost stories and done workshops with tour guides on telling ghost stories, and obviously you see things sort of skeptically from a scientific point of view, but the people that I usually deal with see things skeptically from a historical point of view. And they think, well, history is, provable and it happened, and folklore to them has no value. And that's one of the things that I sort of argue with them about, try to convince them of, is that folklore in and of itself does have value. Even if it's not always true or not wholly true. One of the things that I tell them is that one of the defining characteristics of folklore is that it's not provable or disprovable.
Mm-hmm.
If you can prove a piece of folklore to be true, then it becomes fact. And if you can disprove it, then it becomes fiction. So folklore exists in sort of this middle place which is what makes it so interesting, is that you may know that some parts of it are not true, but there are other parts you're not sure about. And that's, to me, what makes it compelling.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah, it's actually fascinating to me that they would think that there is no, because I've heard that argument given before too, right? Where there's some I guess classes of historian or I guess sects. I mean, there's sects of people in all walks of life and everything, but like you'll have one sect that says folklore is a misguided thing, or something that's interesting but maybe not necessarily historical.
Superstition has kept us back, but
right.
But we've learned from and we're done with, which is
sure. But then at the
true.
same time, I think it does have a lot of very interesting clues about the worldview of the peoples that told these stories about what they really were experiencing at times. I actually get very frustrated with I get very frustrated with Ancient Alien stuff. It drives me crazy. And one of the reasons that I think it makes me
more crazy than chemtrails.
I
just want to try and get a balance. Really? Damn,
yeah.
It jumped up on the list.
I know. And I think it's because of I think it's because they start from the assumption that the myths are 100% factual, right? That they're not just kind of interesting stories or clues. And so to me, it almost takes away from what I think is a very I wouldn't be doing this show if I didn't love the folklore of these ghost stories and things, So, anyways, this is my own little soapbox.
Especially something like that too, because it's not. Me personally, I wouldn't consider like Ancient Aliens to be genuine folklore, because you're just grafting a modern thing onto something else.
Sure.
And it's not something that's come down, over time naturally. I'd really be curious to hear your thoughts about all the flat Earth stuff.
Oh, dude, we could do a whole thing on the flat Earth. You know what? That's another one of those stupid ideas that keeps coming up again and again in history. It's, what the thing with the flat Earth that I find to be so fascinating is that with a little bit of money and a little bit of know-how, all of these people could, in theory, prove to themselves that it's not true, right? One of the most famous flat Earth, one of the most famous arguments for the flat Earth is I'm completely blanking on the name right now, but there's like a waterway in the UK, and it goes straight for miles and miles and miles. It's a man-made river, and what the idea was that this person had, who thought the world was flat, was that if the world was curved, then you should be able to like block your sight line eventually. So in other words, if you stand, say, 6 miles downriver from a point that you put, a 3-foot tall pole, right? There's a certain distance away from that pole that you could walk where you'll no longer be able to see it over the horizon.
Right.
So
'cause it's behind the curvature, but
right.
they don't get what curvature. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Right. So this person's argument was that this piece of ground must be completely flat, and so I should not be able to see it from this many miles away. And so he went that many miles away and he could see it, and he was like, aha, the world is flat. And what he didn't account for was that the ground in the spot that he was standing was 6 feet higher than in the spot that he was at initially. So really, he was looking down at an angle where it definitely would have been possible to see. So, that's the history of the flat Earth thing, is these...
But can't you... Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, can't you argue like flat Earth is sort of... is lore taken to one extreme in the spectrum?
Well,
it's almost like dogmatic belief in something that
I
is
think it's
lore-based.
paranoia.
Yeah, I was going to...
I think it's paranoia taken to the extreme.
Yeah, I think what it is, there's a... I think I'm with you, Mike. I think it's an extension or a continuation of a long series of distrust in institutions and government, right? Because who's the only people that have ever seen the Earth from the sky? Right, it's NASA. And who owns NASA? It's the government. And the government is run by globalist lizards, Marie.
Well, yeah, that you and I can totally agree on. But you could also say that that type of paranoia, that in itself is its own myth, right? That in itself is its own lore to it. Like that entire thing is a fiction that has been internalized so much that it becomes somebody's belief instead of being able to step back and have some sort of rational way of understanding it or disproving it. You're just embedded in it.
It's also not that. It's not that different than the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, or that the Earth can never warm due to human negligence or effects. Right? I mean, it's all part of this idea that the universe is perfect. It's created for humans by a maker, and therefore, not to say that science and religion aren't compatible. I mean, they can be completely compatible. It's up to each person to make that call for themselves. You know what I mean? But I would say fundamentalist religion is not consistent with a scientific worldview because it requires these jumps to mythology, right? And so. Right. This idea of the flat Earth, I mean, we're told that it existed up until Columbus, right?
Oh,
that's kind of the story.
You shouldn't have gotten him going on flat Earth.
That's.
No.
I'm sorry.
I hope you aren't planning to do anything for the next 4 hours.
Seriously, till tomorrow. The sun will be coming up, and I'll still be talking about angles and sunbeam radians and crap. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's something that I think, again, it's one of those. If we look at like the march of science, I do believe that there are going to come points where science simply can't. By definition, there are things science can't explain to us, and like they sound stupid, like they sound like first year philosophy things. But like love, man, and colors, like man, colors, but all of that is true. The way that we perceive color is not actually a quantifiable thing. The way that we feel emotion is not necessarily a quantifiable thing. Although we can quantify it to say like a scale of happiness or joy or something, or measure a pulse rate to get how afraid we are, that still that says nothing about how we literally experience it, right? And so I do think that there's going to come a point where we realize that science is inadequate for describing certain parts of the world just based on what science is, how it's set out. And I think as science becomes more and more all encompassing and kind of, all explaining, I think we're going to see outcroppings like this of little bits of the world where people still think there's room for magic, or there's room for, wonder or conspiracy or whatever. And America is especially rife for that because we have a long history of, I'm not going to believe you just because you have a lab coat on. I'm just a simple farmer, but I know more than NASA. Or I'm just a simple engineer. I know more than my doctor. And I take.
I'm down with you as long as I'm down with that magic being still in there, as long as it doesn't come up and scratch me on the leg. Right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and the thing is,
then I'm gonna lose all my rationality.
Look, I'm a relatively scientific person. I still take vitamins and stuff despite the evidence that it doesn't do any good. I still do that just, because whatever.
Dora's now your mom's gonna be all worried about you, man. But I'm sorry, I'm still tripping out at the fact that you stayed in the jail after seeing.
Can
we just revisit really fast?
Well, it was a little late to back out at that point.
No, man, no. Were you tied down? Was there
they
shackles
already locked
on
the doors?
No, I would have been like, you know what? No, we can. I think I can catch. Riverdale's going to be on CW pretty soon. I think I can catch that. Sorry.
So, Mike, before we end this, because we've been talking for a while, although it's been amazing. I mean, anytime you want to come on, please do so. We got loads of other stuff we can talk about, man. But I was wondering what your opinion is, at least, of the grand unified paranormal theory. And I don't know if even
I get asked that question a lot on the ghost tours.
Yeah.
And I hate when people ask me that. Not
nice clothes, Chris.
Ouch.
No. It's the question that I get asked a lot is, what do you think ghosts are? What do you think? And my answer is usually I don't know. And the even better answer is I don't want to know. For me, I don't want to, and this kind of goes back to, I think, something that Marie was saying earlier, is that I don't think everything needs to be explained. I like the idea that there is mystery, and there are things that I like the idea that there are some gray areas, and maybe it's true and maybe it's not true, and it is, I think it's sometimes nice to have some unanswered questions. And then at the end of the day, I don't know, I would be, that those deep sort of huge metaphysical questions like that, I couldn't answer if I tried. But, insofar as ghosts and stuff go, I have no idea. I like ghost stories, and I enjoy telling ghost stories. I've seen some weird stuff over the years that I can't explain, but I have no idea what's causing it.
Okay. Every time I ask that question, I find it fascinating that I get a completely different answer to everyone I ask it to. And sometimes, Sam from Not Alone, who's on this show a lot, when I asked him that, he started talking about,
he did a haiku.
Yeah, we made a deal with the gray aliens, and look at my beard, and I love Jason and all this other weird stuff. And, I find it fascinating that everyone has their own idea on this, and I actually think I probably I think I'd probably sit closer to what you're saying, where I don't know if I want these things to mix, because it kind of it kind of ruins the point for me. You know,
Mhm.
I think these stories are interesting not only because of their explanatory power, I guess, but also because of what it can tell us about ourselves, you know, and about these stories even existing in the first place for us here. But man, I'm also jealous. Everyone else seems to have a ghost story but me, Marie.
You know, it's cool. I don't think I have one either, but that doesn't mean I'm going to go searching for one. That
Well,
doesn't mean
you
I'm
know-
going to be going into some jail being like, hey, I've got an idea. Get out some s'mores.
This, to actually go back and answer Marie's question of why I stayed in the jail, that was the reason, is because I had spent 19 years telling other people's ghost stories, and I wanted to have a ghost story of my own. And so that's why I went ahead and spent the night in that horrible place.
Damn.
But and it was an interesting night, to say the least.
See, I'm still good with you telling him, Mike. I don't need mine.
I was gonna say,
I'm all good. I'm good.
I always, we're always talking a big game here, but if an alien ever landed in front of me, I'd probably pee my
Oh,
pants
hell
and run away.
no. Oh, yeah.
No!
No, I'm dead. Oh, yeah. I'd be right there with you. I'd be right there with you.
Man. Well, thank you again so much for coming on, Mike. It's seriously been
Thank you for having me.
No problem. It's been such a pleasure. I hope we
Yes,
can get you on
thank you.
again
It's good.
soon. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. That is it for this week's episode, dear listeners. I will be back in 1 week with a full episode, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks with another roundtable. I am, as always, your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host, Marie Mayhew.
Good night, all.
Good night, all. And Mike, thank you again. Everyone, this is Mike Brown from Pleasing Terrors. Mike, where can people find you?
Pleasing Terrors available anywhere you'd normally go to listen to a podcast, and also at Pleasing Terrors on Facebook and Twitter.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again so much for listening, and be back in 1 week.